Have you ever said something you thought you believed, only to have life prove you completely wrong? Sometimes the universe has a way of putting us exactly where we need to be, with exactly the person we never expected to need. The words still echoed in Alessio Marcelli's mind 3 days later as he straightened his Italian silk tie and prepared to leave his penthouse for the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. "I'd never have kids with a black woman." The statement had rolled off his tongue so easily at Sunday dinner, delivered with the same casual certainty he used when discussing business strategies or wine selections. His mother had been pressing him again about settling down, about giving her grandchildren, about carrying on the family traditions that had sustained the Marcelli name for 4 generations in New York. "You need to find a nice Italian girl, Alessio," she had insisted, her weathered hands gesturing emphatically over her homemade pasta sauce. "Someone who understands our ways, our values. Someone who can raise children who know where they come from." His response had been automatic, shaped by 35 years of family expectations and the insular world of organized crime where bloodlines mattered almost as much as loyalty. "Of course, Ma. When I settle down, it'll be with someone who fits our life. Someone who gets it. I'd never have kids with a black woman or anyone who couldn't understand what it means to be part of this family." The conversation had moved on quickly to other topics, but the words lingered now as Alessio surveyed the storm clouds gathering over Manhattan through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Dark and ominous, they seemed to mirror something shifting inside him that he couldn't quite identify. At 35, he was finally feeling the weight of running the Marcelli operations, the endless pressure of maintaining power while keeping his family safe from rivals who would love nothing more than to see him fall. The charity gala was supposed to be a reprieve from the constant vigilance his life required. Public events like this served multiple purposes. They burnished his legitimate business reputation, provided opportunities for networking, and most importantly, they were occasions where rival families typically observed an unspoken truce. Tonight, he would be Alessio Marcelli, the successful real estate developer and philanthropist, not the Don who controlled significant portions of New York's underground economy. Thunder rumbled overhead as his driver navigated through increasingly heavy traffic toward the venue, an elegant waterfront location in Brooklyn that had seemed perfect for an outdoor evening event when the weather forecast had called for clear skies. Now, Alessio watched through tinted windows as the first fat raindrops splattered against the glass, and he found himself hoping the organizers had prepared adequate backup plans. The venue was already bustling with activity when he arrived, despite the threatening weather. Hundreds of New York's elite mingled under enormous white tents that had been hastily erected as the storm approached. String lights twinkled overhead, and servers wove between guests carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was festive despite the weather, filled with the confident chatter of people accustomed to having their plans accommodate whatever obstacles arose. Alessio moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries with business associates and donors, while keeping one eye on his security team positioned strategically throughout the venue. Tommy Ricci flanked his right side, close enough to respond to any threat, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Marco Santos had positioned himself near the main entrance, while Salvatore Chin monitored the perimeter. It was standard protocol for any public appearance, but tonight something felt different. The storm seemed to have everyone on edge, creating an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the weather. He was discussing a potential real estate deal with City Councilman Rodriguez when the first lightning strike illuminated the evening sky like daylight. The crack of thunder that followed was so loud it momentarily silenced the entire gathering, and Alessio felt rather than saw his security team shift to higher alert. Weather was unpredictable, and unpredictability in his world meant vulnerability. That was when he first noticed her. She moved through the crowd with a large camera hanging around her neck, clearly one of the event photographers hired to document the evening for the hospital's marketing materials. What caught his attention wasn't just her striking beauty, though she was undeniably stunning with rich dark skin, intelligent brown eyes, and natural hair styled in an elegant updo. It was the way she carried herself, confident and purposeful, seemingly oblivious to the appreciative glances she was drawing from men throughout the venue. She was photographing a group of young hospital patients who had been brought to the event when the second lightning strike hit. this one close enough to make the lights flicker and send a visible shudder through the gathered crowd. Alessio watched as she immediately knelt to the children's eye level, her warm smile reassuring them even as concerned murmurs rippled through the adult guests. "It's okay, sweethearts," he heard her say, her voice carrying despite the growing noise of wind and rain against the tent walls. "Just a little thunder. You know what my grandmother used to tell me? She said thunder is just the sky's way of applauding all the good things happening down here on Earth." The children giggled, their fear melting away under her gentle attention, and Alessio found himself drawn closer despite having no logical reason to be interested in a photographer's interaction with a group of kids. There was something magnetic about her presence, a warmth and authenticity that seemed rare in his world of calculated conversations and hidden agendas. He was close enough now to see the genuine affection in her expression as she adjusted her camera settings and continued taking photos, capturing candid moments of joy rather than the posed shots that filled most charity event galleries. Professional but personable, skilled but unpretentious. She wore a simple black dress that was elegant without being flashy, and when she moved, there was a natural grace that suggested someone comfortable in her own skin. The wind had been building steadily for the past hour, but now it reached a crescendo that sent table linens fluttering and forced servers to abandon their outdoor stations. Alessio heard the event coordinator's voice over the speaker system, cheerfully announcing that dinner would be moved indoors to the adjacent ballroom, and guests began a generally orderly migration toward the building's main entrance. He lost sight of the photographer in the shuffle, his attention demanded by a conversation with Judge Morrison about an upcoming city planning meeting. But even as he discussed zoning regulations and community development projects, part of his mind remained focused on brown eyes and an infectious smile that had made scared children laugh during a thunderstorm. The ballroom was elegant if slightly cramped, with the entire guest list now packed indoors. Circular tables covered in white linens filled the space, and the hospital's development team had done an admirable job of quickly relocating the silent auction displays and bar stations. Alessio found his assigned seat at a table near the front, surrounded by other major donors and board members, and settled in for what he assumed would be a typical evening of speeches, presentations, and strategic socializing. He was wrong. The lights went out at exactly 9:47, according to the Rolex Submariner his father had given him when he officially took over the family operations. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting everything in an eerie red glow that transformed the elegant ballroom into something that looked more like a scene from a horror movie. Concerned voices rose from every direction, but they were quickly overshadowed by a sound that made Alessio's blood run cold, the distinctive crack of gunfire. Years of living in a world where violence was always a possibility had honed his reflexes to razor sharpness. He was on the ground behind an overturned table before most of the guests had even processed what they were hearing, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock concealed beneath his dinner jacket. Around him, chaos erupted as hundreds of people suddenly realized they were trapped in a confined space with armed attackers. The gunshots were coming from multiple directions, which meant this wasn't a random robbery or a single unstable individual. This was coordinated, professional, and almost certainly aimed at him. The Torino family had been making aggressive moves lately, testing boundaries and pushing against territories that had been clearly defined for decades. Apparently, they had decided that a charity gala provided the perfect cover for a more direct approach. Glass shattered as one of the ballroom's elegant chandeliers took a direct hit, sending crystal fragments raining down on screaming guests who were crawling under tables or pressing themselves against walls. Alessio caught sight of Tommy moving through the chaos, trying to reach his position while returning fire toward the muzzle flashes visible near the room's rear exit. Marco's voice crackled through his earpiece, reporting multiple shooters and requesting immediate backup. But it was another voice that cut through the pandemonium and drew his attention toward the center of the room. The photographer, the woman who had been so gentle with the frightened children, was now taking charge of a different kind of crisis. "Everyone stay low and move toward the kitchen entrance," she was shouting, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from someone accustomed to thinking clearly under pressure. "Keep your heads down and help anyone who's injured. The kitchen has a separate exit that leads to the parking garage." She was crouched behind the overturned gift table, but instead of cowering in fear like most of the civilians, she was systematically helping other guests navigate toward safety. Alessio watched in fascination as she guided an elderly couple toward the kitchen door, then returned to assist a woman in a wheelchair whose companion had apparently abandoned her in the panic. A fresh burst of gunfire erupted from the main entrance, and Alessio realized with growing concern that the Torino shooters had positioned themselves to control both primary exits. Anyone trying to leave through the front would be walking directly into their line of fire, while the rear emergency exit was blocked by at least 2 additional gunmen. It was a well-planned operation designed to trap everyone inside, while they systematically eliminated their primary target, him. The photographer had reached the same tactical conclusion, because she was now directing people away from both obvious exits and towards service areas that most guests probably didn't even know existed. Smart, Alessio thought, even as he kept his own weapon trained on the shadows near the main entrance. She understands the situation and she's adapting instead of panicking. That was when he saw the laser sight. The tiny red that appeared on his chest for just a fraction of a second before sweeping away, but it was enough to confirm what he had already suspected. The Torinos had brought professional equipment and professional shooters, which meant they were serious about finishing this tonight. The red dot reappeared, this time holding steady just above his heart, and Alessio knew he had perhaps 2 seconds before the sniper squeezed the trigger. He never saw her coming. One moment he was preparing to roll left and return fire, and the next he was flying sideways as something slammed into his chest with enough force to knock him completely off balance. He hit the ground hard, his shoulder striking the marble floor with an impact that sent shooting pain down his entire arm. Above him, the distinctive whistle crack of a high-powered rifle round passed through the space where his head had been less than a second earlier. The photographer lay on top of him, breathing hard, her camera equipment scattered around them from the force of her tackle. Up close, her eyes were even more striking than he had noticed before, deep brown with flecks of gold that caught the emergency lighting. But it was the determined expression on her face that truly captured his attention. The look of someone who had just made a split-second decision to risk her own life for a complete stranger. "You need to move," she said urgently, her voice barely audible over the ongoing gunfire and screaming. "There's a service corridor behind the stage that connects to the loading dock. I saw the building plans when I was setting up my equipment earlier." Before he could respond, she was already in motion, helping him to his feet while keeping them both low enough to avoid presenting an easy target. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, suggesting someone who had dealt with dangerous situations before, though he couldn't imagine what circumstances would have given a photographer that kind of experience. They stayed low as they moved toward the stage area, joining a small group of other guests who had followed her earlier directions. Alessio kept his weapon ready, though he was increasingly convinced that the immediate threat was focused on the main room rather than the service areas. Professional shooters would have studied the building's layout, but they had probably concentrated on controlling the obvious escape routes rather than mapping every service corridor and maintenance access. The photographer, he realized, had outthought them by focusing on alternatives that weren't part of the standard emergency evacuation plan. Behind the stage, she led them through a narrow doorway that opened onto a utilitarian corridor clearly designed for staff use rather than guests. The contrast with the ballroom's elegance was jarring, all concrete walls and fluorescent lighting, but it was mercifully quiet compared to the chaos they had left behind. Here, the sounds of gunfire were muted and distant, though still audible enough to remind everyone that they weren't safe yet. The loading dock exit was exactly where she had said it would be, opening onto a section of the parking garage that was far enough from the main building to provide genuine safety. As they emerged into the storm that was still raging outside, Alessio felt his phone vibrating with incoming calls from Marco, from his mother, from other family members who had undoubtedly heard about the attack through their various networks. But for the moment, all of that seemed secondary to the woman standing next to him in the rain, her elegant dress now torn and dirty, her camera equipment damaged beyond repair, her hair disheveled from their escape through the service corridors. She was shivering, whether from cold or adrenaline he couldn't tell, and there was a small cut on her forehead where she had been struck by falling debris during the initial chaos. She had saved his life. A complete stranger had risked everything to tackle him out of the path of a sniper's bullet, then guided him and a dozen other people to safety through back corridors that she had memorized while doing her job. She had been braver and more resourceful than most of his trained security personnel, and she had done it all without any apparent expectation of reward or recognition. "You're bleeding," he said, reaching out to gently touch the cut on her forehead. "I'm fine," she replied, though she didn't pull away from his touch. "Are you hurt? You hit the ground pretty hard." "Nothing serious. Thanks to you." They looked at each other for a long moment, rain streaming down their faces, both of them still processing what had just happened. Around them, other survivors were making phone calls, summoning rides, beginning the process of returning to whatever remained of their normal lives. But Alessio found himself reluctant to break the strange intimacy of this moment, this pause between the crisis and the inevitable aftermath. "I'm Zara," she said finally. "Zara Williams. Alessio Marcelli. And I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would do." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Most people would have hidden, would have focused solely on their own survival. She had chosen to act, to help, to risk herself for others. In his world, that kind of courage was rare enough among trained professionals. To find it in a photographer at a charity gala was extraordinary. The sound of sirens was growing louder now, emergency vehicles finally beginning to arrive on scene. Soon this parking garage would be flooded with police, paramedics, FBI agents, and reporters. His lawyers would need to be contacted, statements would need to be given, and the complex machinery of damage control would need to be set in motion. The Torino family would face swift and decisive retaliation for their breach of the unspoken rules that kept their world functioning. But first, he needed to make sure Zara Williams was safe. "You can't go home tonight," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. "If they targeted me specifically, they might have done research on everyone who was here. Anyone who helped me could become a target." She frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the implication. "I'm nobody special. I was just doing my job." "You're not nobody, and after tonight, you're not anonymous either. There were security cameras, other witnesses. If they want to find you, they will." Thunder rolled overhead, punctuating his words with an ominous rumble that seemed to emphasize the danger she might not fully understand yet. In the distance, he could see the flashing lights of the first police cars pulling into the parking lot, and he knew their window for private conversation was closing rapidly. "Let me help you," he said. "Let me make sure you're safe until we know how this is going to play out." She studied his face for a long moment, and he found himself hoping she would say yes for reasons that went far beyond simple gratitude. There was something about Zara Williams that had captured his attention even before she saved his life, something that made him want to know more about the woman who could calm frightened children and outthink professional assassins in the same evening. 3 days ago, he had told his mother he would never have children with a black woman. Tonight, looking into Zara Williams' intelligent brown eyes, those words seemed like they had been spoken by a different person entirely. A person who had never met someone brave enough to throw herself into the path of danger for a stranger, smart enough to find escape routes that trained killers had overlooked, and beautiful enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about what he wanted. "Okay," she said finally, "but just until tomorrow. Just until things settle down." He nodded, though something told him that after tonight, things in his carefully ordered world would never settle down quite the same way again. The ride to his penthouse passed in relative silence, both of them still processing the events of the evening while the city lights blurred past the bulletproof windows of Alessio's armored sedan. Zara sat stiffly in the leather passenger seat, her torn dress and disheveled hair a stark contrast to the vehicle's pristine interior. Every few minutes, she would glance at the man beside her, this stranger whose life she had saved and who was now insisting on protecting hers in return. Alessio found himself stealing looks at her profile as Marco navigated through the late-night Manhattan traffic, taking an indirect route to ensure they weren't being followed. The emergency lighting in the ballroom hadn't done her justice. In the soft glow of the city lights, her skin had a warm richness that reminded him of expensive cognac, and despite everything she had been through tonight, there was a dignity in the way she carried herself that spoke to an inner strength he was only beginning to appreciate. She had saved his life. The reality of that fact was still settling into his consciousness, along with the uncomfortable recognition that his first instinct hadn't been gratitude but surprise. He had been raised in a world where women were protected, not protectors, where quick thinking in crisis situations was the domain of trained professionals, not civilian photographers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Zara Williams had shattered several of his assumptions in the space of a few seconds, and he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building he owned in Tribeca, with views of the Hudson River that had cost more than most people made in a lifetime. As the private elevator carried them upward, Alessio watched Zara's reflection in the polished steel doors and saw her taking in details with the same observational skills she had probably used to memorize the ballroom's service corridors. She noticed everything but commented on nothing, maintaining a composed silence that somehow managed to be both professional and guarded. When the elevator opened directly into his foyer, her sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but he caught it. The space was designed to impress, all marble and modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering city below. Italian leather furniture arranged in conversation areas that had been featured in Architectural Digest, Persian rugs that were museum-quality pieces, lighting that had been designed by an artist whose work hung in galleries around the world. "It's beautiful," Zara said quietly, but there was something in her tone that wasn't entirely comfortable. She was looking around like she was trying to memorize emergency exits rather than admire the decor. "Let me get Dr. Castellano up here to look at that cut," Alessio said, pulling out his phone. "He's discreet and thorough, and he makes house calls. I don't need a doctor. It's just a scratch." But she swayed slightly as she said it, and when she put a hand to the wall to steady herself, he saw her wince. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the physical and emotional toll of what she had experienced. In his world, he was accustomed to people pushing through pain and exhaustion because showing weakness could be dangerous. But Zara wasn't part of his world, and she had no reason to pretend she wasn't hurt. "Humor me," he said gently. "It's the least I can do after what you did tonight." While they waited for the doctor, Alessio showed her to the guest suite on the 2nd floor, a spacious room with its own bathroom and sitting area that had been designed for visiting family members or business associates who needed to stay overnight. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the king-sized bed with its Egyptian cotton linens, the antique armoire, the small balcony that overlooked the city. "This is too much," she said. "I can't accept this." "You're not accepting anything. You're staying here because it's not safe for you to go home, and this happens to be where I live." But he could see the conflict in her expression, the tension between gratitude and independence that suggested someone who was accustomed to taking care of herself. In the better lighting of the penthouse, he could also see that she was even more beautiful than he had first thought. Her dress, despite being torn and stained, couldn't hide the curves of her figure, and when she moved, there was a natural grace that drew his attention in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or protection. "There are clothes in the closet that should fit you," he said, forcing himself to focus on practical matters rather than the way the fabric of her dress clung to her hips. "My sister sometimes stays here when she's in the city. Help yourself to anything you need." Dr. Castellano arrived 20 minutes later, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been providing medical care to the Marcelli family for over 2 decades. He examined the cut on Zara's forehead with professional thoroughness, cleaned and bandaged it properly, and checked for signs of concussion or other injuries she might not have noticed in the chaos. "You're very fortunate," he told her as he packed up his medical bag. "The cut is superficial and shouldn't leave a scar. But you should take it easy for the next day or 2. Head injuries can be unpredictable, and you've been through significant trauma tonight." After the doctor left, Zara emerged from the guest room wearing a simple white t-shirt and black leggings that belonged to his sister. The casual clothes somehow made her look younger and more vulnerable, though the determined expression in her eyes remained unchanged. She had taken her hair down from its formal updo, and the natural curls framed her face in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. He had poured himself a scotch and was standing at the windows looking out at the city when she joined him in the main living area. The lights of Manhattan sparkled below them like a constellation that had fallen to earth, and in the reflection on the glass, he could see her studying him with the same careful attention she had given to his apartment. "I should thank you properly," she said. "What you did tonight, bringing me here, getting me medical attention. I know it was more than just returning a favor. He turned to face her, noting the way she maintained eye contact despite clearly being out of her element. Most people in her situation would be intimidated by the obvious wealth surrounding them, by the implications of what it meant to be in the private space of someone like him. But Zara seemed more cautious than intimidated, more curious than impressed. "What do you do?" he asked. "Besides photography, I mean. I'm a freelance photographer, but that doesn't exactly pay the bills in New York. I also work part-time at a coffee shop in Soho and do some tutoring on weekends. The charity event was a good gig, better than my usual wedding and graduation shoots." She was telling him about her life with the same straightforward honesty she had shown throughout the evening. No false modesty or attempts to make her situation sound better than it was. He found himself admiring her willingness to be genuine, especially given that she was talking to someone whose lifestyle clearly operated on a completely different economic scale. "No family in the area? Just me. My parents are back in Atlanta, and I have a sister in grad school at Northwestern. I've been in New York for about 3 years, trying to build up my portfolio and client base." "It must be difficult," he said. "Expensive city for someone starting out." She shrugged, but he caught the flash of vulnerability in her expression before she covered it. "I manage. It's what I wanted, so I make it work." His phone buzzed with an incoming call, and when he saw Marco's name on the screen, he knew it was time to get an update on the situation they had left behind. "Excuse me for a minute," he told Zara, moving toward his office. The conversation was brief but informative. 3 confirmed dead, all Torino soldiers. Tommy had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but was stable. The FBI was already on scene, along with half the NYPD and enough reporters to guarantee that the attack would be front-page news by morning. Most importantly, they had recovered intelligence that confirmed the hit had been specifically targeted at Alessio, with orders to eliminate anyone who interfered. When he returned to the living room, Zara was standing at the windows with her arms wrapped around herself, looking small and lost in clothes that were slightly too big for her. The reality of what she had walked into was probably starting to sink in now that the immediate crisis was over. "How bad is it?" she asked without turning around. 3 men are dead. My security team thinks it was retaliation for some recent business disputes, nothing that should affect you directly." But she was smart enough to read between the lines, and when she turned to face him, he could see the growing understanding in her eyes. "You're not just a real estate developer, are you?" He could lie to her, maintain the fiction that had served him well in legitimate business circles. But something about the events of the evening, about the way she had risked herself for his safety, made deception feel wrong. She deserved honesty, even if it complicated everything. "I'm involved in family businesses that aren't always strictly legal," he said carefully. "Tonight's attack was probably connected to that side of my life. Organized crime." It wasn't a question, and he didn't insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. "Yes." She nodded slowly, processing this information with the same calm assessment she had brought to everything else. "I suspected as much. The security detail, the way you handled yourself during the shooting, the fact that you have a private doctor on call. It all fits. Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath while he waited for her response. In his experience, most civilians reacted to knowledge about his real occupation with either fear or fascination, both of which created their own complications. But Zara seemed to be approaching the information like she approached everything else, with thoughtful consideration rather than emotional reaction. "It should," she said finally. "Logically, I should be terrified and demanding that you take me to the police station right now. But you're not." "No, I'm not. Maybe because you saved my life tonight, too. Maybe because nothing about you seems like the stereotype I would have expected." He moved closer, drawn by something in her voice that he couldn't quite identify. In the soft lighting of his living room, with the city spread out below them like a glittering backdrop, she looked beautiful and brave, and completely out of place in his carefully controlled world. "What did you expect?" "Someone less," she said simply. "Less thoughtful, less concerned about my well-being, less respectful. The men in my experience who have real power usually make sure everyone knows it. And I don't." "You do, but differently. You're not trying to intimidate me or impress me. You're just trying to keep me safe." The observation was more perceptive than she probably realized. Most people responded to his presence with either submission or challenge, recognizing the authority he carried and positioning themselves accordingly. But Zara seemed to see past the power to the person underneath, and her lack of fear was both refreshing and dangerously attractive. He was standing close enough now to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume mixed with the hospital soap she had used to clean up. The awareness between them was building into something that felt both inevitable and complicated, attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their practical conversations. When his phone rang again, the sudden sound made them both step back, the spell of proximity broken by the reminder that the outside world was still demanding his attention. The caller ID showed his mother's number, and he knew that avoiding the conversation any longer would only increase her anxiety about what had happened. "I should take this," he said reluctantly. "Of course." But as he moved toward his office again, he caught sight of Zara settling onto the sofa with her legs curled under her, looking more relaxed than she had since they arrived. Something about seeing her in his space, comfortable despite everything she had learned about his life, made his chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The conversation with his mother was predictably emotional and lengthy. She had heard about the attack through family networks and was demanding details, reassurance, and promises that he would increase his security until the Torino situation was completely resolved. By the time he finished calming her fears and coordinating tomorrow's response with other family members, nearly an hour had passed. When he emerged from his office, he found Zara asleep on the sofa, curled up like a cat with one of his sister's sweaters pulled over her like a blanket. In sleep, the composure she maintained while awake had softened into something more vulnerable, and he could see traces of exhaustion in the shadows under her eyes that spoke to long days and late nights working multiple jobs to pursue her dreams. She had saved his life tonight, and in return, he had brought her into his world of danger and moral ambiguity. But looking at her now, peaceful despite everything that had happened, he found himself hoping that she would choose to stay long enough for him to figure out what it was about Zara Williams that made him want to be a better man than he thought he was capable of being. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marco. "Torino retaliation confirmed. They know about the woman who helped you. Recommend extended protection until threat is neutralized." Alessio looked down at Zara sleeping on his sofa and felt something shift in his chest, a fierce protectiveness that went beyond simple gratitude or obligation. 3 days ago, he had told his mother he would never have children with a black woman. Tonight, watching Zara Williams sleep in his apartment, he was beginning to realize that some of his most deeply held convictions might not be as unshakable as he had always believed. Zara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Manhattan that belonged in a magazine. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind struggling to reconcile the luxury surrounding her with the fragmented memories of gunfire and chaos from the night before. Then it all came rushing back. The attack, her desperate tackle that had saved a stranger's life, the revelation that the stranger was involved in organized crime, and her current situation as a house guest in what was essentially a fortress disguised as a penthouse. She found Alessio in his kitchen, standing at a professional-grade stove that probably cost more than her annual rent. He had changed from his torn evening wear into dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and his dark hair was slightly mussed in a way that made him look younger and more approachable than the commanding presence he had been last night. He was cooking with the kind of easy competence that suggested this wasn't a show put on for her benefit, but rather a regular part of his routine. "Good morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence even though she hadn't made a sound. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected, considering everything that happened." That was true, though she wasn't entirely sure why. By all logic, she should have spent the night staring at the ceiling, processing the traumatic events and questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. Instead, she had fallen into the deepest, most restful sleep she had experienced in months, as if some part of her subconscious had recognized that she was safer here than she had been in her own apartment. "Coffee's fresh, and breakfast is almost ready. There are pastries from a bakery in Little Italy that my mother insists is the only place in the city that makes decent sfogliatelle." The casual mention of his mother created an immediate tension that neither of them addressed directly, though Zara felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure. She had heard enough fragments of his phone conversation the night before to know that family was both central to his life and likely to be complicated by her presence in it. She poured herself coffee from a machine that looked like it belonged in an Italian cafe, noting that he had somehow managed to prepare it exactly the way she preferred despite having no way of knowing her preferences. The small consideration felt more intimate than it should have, suggesting someone who paid attention to details and cared about the comfort of others. "You didn't have to cook for me," she said, settling onto one of the bar stools that lined the kitchen island. "I like cooking. It's relaxing." But there was something in his tone that suggested cooking wasn't the only reason he had gotten up early to prepare an elaborate breakfast. He was giving them both something to do with their hands and focus on while they navigated the awkwardness of their situation, the strange intimacy of sharing morning routines with someone who was essentially a stranger. They ate in relative silence for the first few minutes, the kind of comfortable quiet that surprised Zara with its naturalness. She had expected to feel out of place in his sophisticated environment, overwhelmed by the obvious wealth and the implications of what it represented. Instead, she found herself studying the way he moved around his own space, noting the small details that revealed personality beneath the careful control. Family photos on the kitchen windowsill showing a younger version of him with an older woman who had his eyes and a teenage girl with the same stubborn chin. A well-worn cookbook in Italian that was clearly used regularly rather than displayed for show. A small herb garden growing on the balcony that was visible through the glass doors, suggesting someone who found pleasure in nurturing growing things despite living in the concrete heart of the city. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, setting down her coffee cup with a decisiveness that made him look up from his plate. "Of course. Last night, when you were talking to your mother, I couldn't help overhearing part of the conversation." She seemed concerned about more than just the attack. He was quiet for a moment, his expression becoming more guarded, and she wondered if she had pushed too far too fast. But then he set down his fork and met her eyes with the same directness he had shown when admitting his involvement in organized crime. "My mother has very specific ideas about the kind of woman I should settle down with. Traditional ideas that don't leave much room for deviation from family expectations. And I represent a pretty significant deviation from those expectations." You could say that. The honesty was both refreshing and painful, confirming what she had suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge directly. In her experience, family disapproval was rarely about individual character and more often about prejudices that ran too deep to be easily overcome. She had dealt with similar situations before, though never in circumstances quite as dramatic as these. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you share those traditional ideas?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond casual breakfast conversation. She watched him consider his response, seeing the internal conflict play out in his expression as he weighed honesty against diplomacy. "I thought I did," he said finally. 3 days ago, I would have told you with complete certainty that I understood exactly what I wanted and what my life was going to look like. Traditional Italian family, traditional values, traditional expectations about marriage and children. And now? Now I'm having breakfast with a woman who saved my life, and I'm realizing that some of my most fundamental assumptions might have been based more on habit than actual conviction. The admission created a shift in the atmosphere between them, a recognition that their conversation had moved beyond polite small talk into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. Zara found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only the kind of uncomfortable honesty that suggested someone grappling with genuine internal conflict. "For what it's worth," she said, "I understand family pressure about dating choices. My parents have their own set of expectations that don't always align with my actual life. Such as their belief that I should be more careful about getting involved with men whose lifestyles might put me in danger. Ironically, they've been saying that about every guy I've dated since college, and none of them were actually involved in organized crime." He laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire face and made him look younger and less intimidating. "So I'm the first legitimate threat to your safety? Definitely the first one who required a bulletproof car to get me to breakfast." The humor helped ease some of the tension, but it couldn't entirely mask the serious undercurrents of their situation. They were two people from fundamentally different worlds, thrown together by circumstances that had forced them to confront prejudices and assumptions that might otherwise have remained safely abstract. "Can I ask what happened?" she said. "To make you so certain about what you wanted?" He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful experience rather than theoretical prejudice. "When I was 22, I was engaged to a woman named Isabella Torino. Beautiful, Italian, from a family that understood our world. The perfect choice according to everyone who mattered. Torino, as in the people who attacked us last night? Her brother, actually. The engagement was as much about business as love, a way to unite two families and end decades of territorial disputes. What happened? She broke it off 3 weeks before the wedding. Said she couldn't spend her life wondering if every phone call would be the one telling her I was dead. She married a banker from Connecticut and hasn't spoken to me since." The story explained a lot about his defensive certainties, his reliance on family tradition as a guide for life choices that involved unavoidable risk. But it also revealed a vulnerability that made her heart ache for the young man who had learned that love wasn't always enough to overcome fear. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been devastating." "It was educational. I learned that our life isn't compatible with most people's dreams, and it's better to be realistic about that from the beginning." "But you're not being realistic about me," she said gently. "You're making the same mistake in reverse, assuming that I can't handle your world because of assumptions about what people like me want or fear. People like you? Black women. Women from different backgrounds. Women who didn't grow up understanding the rules of organized crime families." Her directness seemed to catch him off guard, and she could see him processing the implications of what she was saying. She had put their racial and cultural differences on the table explicitly, forcing him to confront the prejudices he had expressed to his mother just days earlier. "I've faced discrimination before, Alessio. I've been told I wasn't the right fit for opportunities, that my background didn't align with company culture, that clients might be more comfortable with someone who looked more like what they expected. The difference is that when people have made assumptions about my capabilities based on my race, they've usually been wrong." "Have I made assumptions about your capabilities?" "You're making assumptions about my courage, about my ability to understand complex situations and make informed decisions about the risks I'm willing to accept." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and she could see that it resonated with him in ways that simple reassurance wouldn't have. She wasn't asking for his protection based on weakness or naivety. She was demanding recognition of her agency, her right to choose her own level of involvement based on complete information rather than paternalistic assumptions. He moved around the kitchen island to stand closer to her, close enough that she could see the green-gray flecks in his eyes and catch the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with the warm smell of breakfast they had shared. "You're right," he said. "I am making assumptions, but not just about your race or background. I'm making assumptions because letting you get close to this life, to me, feels like the most selfish thing I could possibly do. Why? Because I already care about you more than is smart for either of us. And that was before I knew how brave you are, how intelligent, how beautiful you look drinking coffee in my kitchen like you belong here." The confession hung between them, raw and honest and more intimate than anything physical could have been. Zara felt her breath catch as he reached up to touch the bandage on her forehead, his fingers gentle against the injury she had sustained while saving his life. "Alessio," she whispered, and then he was kissing her. It started soft and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but when she leaned into him instead, the kiss deepened with a passion that had been building since the first moment he noticed her at the charity gala. His hands came up to frame her face, and she could feel the leashed strength in his touch, the careful control of someone who was accustomed to being gentle with things that mattered to him. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she could see her own confusion and desire reflected in his expression. The attraction between them was undeniable, but so were the complications that came with acting on it. His phone rang, shattering the moment like glass hitting concrete. The caller ID showed his mother's number again, and the timing felt like a cosmic reminder of all the obstacles that stood between them and the possibility of something real. "I should take this," he said reluctantly. She nodded, stepping back to give him space, but she could see the internal struggle playing out on his face as he answered the call. His mother's voice was loud enough that Zara could hear fragments of the conversation even from across the kitchen, and what she heard made her stomach clench with anxiety. Photos, his mother was saying. Pictures of you with that black girl from last night. They're asking questions, Alessio. Questions about whether the family is changing its standards about appropriate relationships. The disapproval in the older woman's voice was unmistakable, and Zara felt each word like a physical blow. She had known that their different backgrounds would create complications, but hearing herself discussed like a public relations problem by people who had never met her was more painful than she had anticipated. When Alessio ended the call, the careful distance he maintained told her everything she needed to know about the conversation's content. The easy intimacy they had built over breakfast had been replaced by the weight of external pressures that neither of them could ignore. There are photographs of us leaving the venue together last night, he said finally. Someone leaked them to gossip columnists who were speculating about my personal life. And that's a problem. It's a complication. For both of us. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. She watched his expression change as he read it, saw the moment when concern shifted into something much more dangerous. What is it? Marco just sent me a surveillance photo taken this morning outside your apartment building. 2 men with cameras, but not the kind that journalists use. The implication was clear, and Zara felt cold dread settle in her stomach as she realized that her decision to help a stranger had drawn attention from people who viewed her as either an asset or a liability rather than a person with her own agency and choices. They're watching me. They're watching you because you matter to me now, and in my world, that makes you valuable in ways that have nothing to do with who you are as an individual. He moved closer again, but this time his proximity felt protective rather than romantic, and she could see the shift in his demeanor from the man who had kissed her to the dawn, who made life-and-death decisions on a daily basis. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Zara. Whatever it takes, however long this takes to resolve, I will keep you safe. The promise was absolute, delivered with a conviction that made her believe him completely. But it also highlighted the fundamental reality of their situation. She was no longer a free agent making independent choices about her own life. By saving his life, she had become part of his world whether she was ready for that responsibility or not. Looking into his eyes, seeing the fierce protectiveness there mixed with the same desire that had made her pulse race during their kiss, Zara realized that the question was no longer whether she could handle his dangerous world. The question was whether either of them was prepared for how much they were willing to risk for the possibility of love that transcended the boundaries both of them had thought were unbreakable. The call came at 3 in the afternoon, while they were sharing a quiet lunch on his terrace, the city spreading out below them like a living map of possibilities and dangers. Zara had been telling him about her photography, about the way she saw light and shadow differently depending on her subject's story, when Marco's name appeared on Alessio's phone screen with the urgency that meant immediate attention required. The conversation was brief and conducted in rapid Italian, but Zara didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone of crisis management. She watched Alessio's expression grow increasingly grim as he listened, saw the moment when his focus shifted completely from the man enjoying lunch with a beautiful woman to the don responsible for protecting everyone in his orbit. What happened? She asked when he ended the call. Your apartment was broken into this morning. Not a burglary. They were looking for information about you, about your connections, about anything they could use as leverage. The news hit her like a physical blow, the reality of violation mixing with the deeper understanding that her old life had become completely inaccessible. Her photography equipment, her personal belongings, the small space that had represented independence and dreams, all of it contaminated now by the intrusion of dangerous men with dangerous purposes. Did they find anything? Marco's team got there first, cleaned up what they could. But Zara, you can't go back there. Not until this is completely resolved. She nodded, though part of her was still processing the magnitude of what had just changed. This morning she had been a house guest, someone temporarily displaced by extraordinary circumstances. Now she was effectively a refugee from her own life, dependent entirely on the protection of a man she had known for less than 48 hours. I need to call my clients, cancel my bookings for the next few weeks. Already handled. Marco contacted everyone on your schedule, told them you had a family emergency that required you to leave town temporarily. The efficiency with which he had anticipated her needs was both comforting and unsettling, evidence of how completely his world operated on different principles than the one she was accustomed to. In her world, people asked permission before making decisions that affected your life. In his world, protection meant taking decisive action without the luxury of consultation. "You think of everything," she said. "I think of keeping you safe. Everything else is details." But even as he said it, she could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He was accustomed to protecting people, to making choices that prioritized security over convenience or preference. What he wasn't accustomed to was caring about someone whose presence in his life created as many vulnerabilities as it solved. "Come inside," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "We need to talk about what this means, what options we have going forward." His living room felt different in the afternoon light, less imposing and more intimate than it had seemed the night before. Zara settled onto the sofa where she had slept, noting how easily she had adapted to moving through his space like it was beginning to feel familiar. When he sat beside her, close enough that she could see the tension around his eyes, she felt the same electric awareness that had been building between them since their kiss that morning. "Tell me about your world," she said. "Help me understand what I'm really dealing with." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him considering how much truth to share, how much reality someone from outside his life could actually handle. When he finally began speaking, his voice carried the weight of years spent navigating the complexities of power and loyalty and survival. "My family has been part of the fabric of this city for 4 generations. We provide services that the legitimate world needs but can't officially acknowledge. Protection, dispute resolution, access to resources and opportunities that don't exist through conventional channels. You make it sound almost respectable. Parts of it are. We follow rules, we honor commitments, we protect people who can't protect themselves. But we also operate outside the law when necessary, and we resolve conflicts in ways that don't involve courtrooms or legal precedent. And the people who attacked us the other night? The Torino family has been pushing boundaries, testing whether we're as strong as we used to be. Last night was their way of making a definitive statement about their intentions. Will it work?" He turned to look at her directly, and the smile that crossed his face was sharp-edged and completely without humor. "No, it won't work. By the end of the week, the Torino family will no longer be a concern for anyone." The casual certainty with which he discussed what amounted to warfare should have frightened her. Instead, Zara found herself oddly reassured by the competence he radiated, the absolute confidence of someone who had never lost a conflict that mattered. She was beginning to understand that his protection wasn't a courtesy or a temporary arrangement. It was a commitment that would be honored regardless of personal cost. "What about us?" she asked. "What about this thing that's happening between us?" "That's more complicated. Because of your family's expectations. Because of everything. My mother, my responsibilities, the reality that caring about you makes you a target for anyone who wants to hurt me. But you do care about me." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it like one. "Yes, more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. More than is smart for either of us." The confession created a shift in the atmosphere between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that went beyond gratitude or physical attraction. Zara felt her heart rate increase as he moved closer, as his hand came up to touch her cheek with the same gentle reverence he had shown that morning. "I should be afraid of you," she said. "Of this life, of what wanting to be part of it says about me. But you're not. I'm terrified. But not of you. I'm afraid of how much I want this, how right it feels to be here with you despite every logical reason why it shouldn't work." When he kissed her this time, it was with the kind of desperate intensity that spoke to weeks of attraction compressed into days, to the recognition that whatever was building between them was approaching a point of no return. She kissed him back with equal hunger, her hands sliding into his dark hair, her body pressing closer despite the voice in her head that insisted she should be more careful about diving headfirst into dangerous waters. The kiss deepened, and she could taste the coffee they had shared earlier, could feel the careful control he maintained even in passion. When his hands moved to her waist, she arched into his touch, marveling at the way he seemed to know exactly how to make her body respond. There was skill in his caresses, but more than that, there was attention, as if learning her preferences was as important to him as satisfying his own desire. Are you sure about this? He asked against her lips, his voice rough with want, but still giving her the opportunity to change her mind. Instead of answering with words, she began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the tremor of anticipation that was building low in her stomach. His skin was warm and scarred in places that told stories she didn't know yet, and when she pressed her palms flat against his chest, she could feel his heart racing as fast as her own. They moved together with an urgency that surprised them both, clothing disappearing between kisses and caresses that grew progressively more intimate. When he carried her to his bedroom, Zara felt a moment of surreal disconnection from reality, as if she was watching someone else make the choice to trust a man whose world operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. But when he laid her down on his bed and looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, all of her doubts evaporated in the face of pure desire. His touch was reverent and thorough, taking time to explore every curve and hollow while whispering endearments in Italian that she didn't understand but felt in her bones. When he finally moved over her, there was a moment of perfect clarity where she could see her entire future balanced on the edge of this decision. She could pull back, return to her safe but solitary life, pretend that the past 2 days had been an adventure rather than a transformation. Or she could trust the man who had shown her more care and protection in 48 hours than most people experienced in months of conventional dating. She chose trust. The joining was slow and careful, his attention focused entirely on her comfort and pleasure rather than his own urgency. When she gasped and arched beneath him, he stilled completely, giving her time to adjust to the feeling of connection that went far beyond physical sensation. There was something profound about the way he looked at her in that moment, as if he was seeing not just her body but her soul, as if this intimacy was as transformative for him as it was for her. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through his bedroom windows, her head on his chest, his hand stroking gently through her hair. The contentment she felt was so complete it was almost disorienting, a peace that seemed to encompass every part of her being in ways she had never experienced before. "That changes everything," she said quietly. "Yes, it does." His voice carried a note of wonder that matched her own feelings, as if neither of them had expected the physical connection to create such profound emotional intimacy. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a commitment that transcended words or promises. "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of surprise, as if the realization had caught him off guard. "I love you too." The admission felt both inevitable and terrifying, an acknowledgement of feelings that had developed with impossible speed but undeniable intensity. Zara had never believed in love at first sight, but what she felt for Alessio seemed to transcend rational timelines and sensible progression. They were still wrapped around each other, still processing the magnitude of what they had just shared, when the sound of the private elevator arriving made them both freeze. Alessio was on his feet instantly, reaching for the gun he kept in his nightstand, his body positioned protectively between Zara and the bedroom door. "Alessio?" A woman's voice called from the main living area, speaking in Italian with the kind of imperious authority that suggested someone accustomed to immediate attention. "Dove say?" His mother. The tension that flooded his expression was answer enough, even before he confirmed it with a muttered curse that needed no translation. "Get dressed," he said quietly. Quickly, but it was too late for damage control. The sound of heels on marble was approaching the bedroom, and Zara barely had time to pull a sheet around herself before the door opened without ceremony to reveal a woman in her early 70s with silver hair, expensive clothes, and dark eyes that took in the scene with immediate and obvious disapproval. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become excruciating. 3 people frozen in a tableau that perfectly illustrated every conflict and complication that had been building since the night of the attack. Zara felt exposed and vulnerable despite the sheet, acutely aware that she was meeting Alessio's mother for the first time while naked in his bed. When the older woman finally spoke, her voice was cold with a disappointment that felt like judgment delivered from a great height. "So this is the black girl who thinks she can trap my son with her body." The words hit Zara like physical blows, each one chosen for maximum damage and delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke to deeply held prejudices. She felt Alessio tense beside her, saw the moment when his protective instincts warred with lifelong habits of filial respect. "Mama," he said, his voice carrying a warning that his mother chose to ignore. "Don't mama me, Alessio. I raised you better than this. I taught you the importance of family honor, of choosing a wife who understands what it means to be part of our world. Zara understands more than you think. She understands how to seduce a man into forgetting his responsibilities. Look at you, naked with this woman while your family's reputation is being discussed in every social circle in the city." The conversation continued in rapid Italian, voices rising with each exchange, and though Zara couldn't follow the specific words, the tone was unmistakable. She was being discussed as if she weren't present, as if her feelings and perspectives were irrelevant to decisions about her own life. When Alessio's voice rose to match his mother's volume, she heard her name mentioned alongside words that sounded like condemnation and dismissal. Finally, unable to bear being talked about rather than talked to, Zara stood up with as much dignity as she could manage while wrapped in a sheet. "I should go," she said quietly. "No," Alessio said immediately. "You're not going anywhere." But his mother's next words, delivered in perfect English for maximum impact, stopped all of them in their tracks. "If you choose this black whore over your family, Alessio, you will be choosing to destroy everything 4 generations of Marcelli men have built. Is one night with this woman worth losing everything you are?" The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence, Zara heard the echo of every doubt she had tried to suppress about whether love could really overcome the barriers that separated their worlds. Looking at Alessio's face, seeing the anguish there as he was forced to choose between the woman he claimed to love and the family that had shaped his entire identity, she wondered if some obstacles were simply too large to overcome, no matter how strong the feelings on both sides. The silence in Alessio's bedroom stretched until it became unbearable. 3 people frozen in a tableau of conflict that felt like the climax of every tension that had been building since the night they met. Zara stood wrapped in his sheet, dignity intact despite her vulnerability, while his mother waited for the response that would determine the trajectory of all their lives. When Alessio finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of finality that ended conversations rather than continuing them. "Get out," he said to his mother. "Get out of my home, and don't come back until you can speak about the woman I love with the respect she deserves." The older woman's shock was visible, her face flushing with anger and disbelief that her son would choose defiance over deference. But something in his expression must have convinced her that argument would be futile, because she turned and left without another word, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp precision that spoke to rage barely held in check. After the elevator doors closed, Zara began getting dressed with mechanical efficiency, her movements careful and controlled in the way that suggested someone processing emotional trauma. Alessio watched her, seeing the walls she was rebuilding between them with each piece of clothing she put on. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Yes, I do. Your mother was right about one thing. I don't understand your world well enough to know what I'm destroying by being here. You're not destroying anything. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. But at what cost?" She turned to face him, and he could see the pain in her eyes mixing with a resolve that made his chest tighten with dread. "Your family built something over 4 generations, Alessio. I've been in your life for 3 days. The math isn't complicated. This isn't about math. This is about choosing the life I want instead of accepting the life I was born into. And if those are mutually exclusive?" He started to respond, to argue that they could find a way to make it work despite the obstacles. But his phone rang with Marco's ringtone set to emergency priority. The timing felt like fate conspiring against them. Another crisis demanding his attention when he needed to focus entirely on convincing the woman he loved not to walk out of his life. "I have to take this," he said apologetically. The conversation was brief, but delivered news that changed everything. Julia, his 20-year-old sister who was supposed to be safely enrolled at Columbia University, had been taken from her apartment 2 hours ago by men driving a black SUV with no license plates. The security cameras in her building had been disabled, but witnesses confirmed it was a professional operation conducted in broad daylight. The Torino family had escalated beyond attacking him directly to targeting the people he cared about most. "What is it?" Zara asked, seeing the change in his expression. They took my sister. The words hit the room like a physical force, transforming the personal crisis between them into something much more immediate and dangerous. Zara forgot about gathering her belongings, forgot about the painful conversation with his mother, forgot about everything except the anguish she could see in his face. Where? We're working on that. Marco's coordinating with our contacts in law enforcement, but the Torinos have had weeks to plan this. They'll have moved her somewhere secure, somewhere they think we won't find her quickly. What do they want? Me. They want me to turn myself over in exchange for her safe return. And you're going to do it. It wasn't a question. She could see the decision already forming in his expression, the calculation of someone who would sacrifice anything to protect family. But she could also see the conflict there, the recognition that trading his life for his sisters would leave other people vulnerable, including the woman standing in his bedroom who had become equally precious to him. I have to, he said. She's just a kid, Zara. She's in college studying art history and dating a boy who wants to be a teacher. She's never hurt anyone, never been involved in any of this. But if you go to them, they'll kill you both anyway. That's how these situations work, isn't it? The observation was accurate enough to make him pause, and she could see him processing the tactical reality that ransom exchanges rarely ended with both parties walking away safely. The Torinos didn't want money or territory. They wanted to eliminate the Marcelli family's power permanently, and killing both him and his sister would accomplish that goal while sending a message to other families about the consequences of resistance. Then what do you suggest? He asked, his voice carrying the desperation of someone facing an impossible choice. We get her back without giving them what they want. We find where they're keeping her, and we take her away from them. We? You think I'm going to let you walk into this alone after everything we've shared? After I just fell in love with you? The declaration was delivered with the same matter-of-fact courage she had shown when saving his life at the charity gala, and it hit him with equal force. She wasn't offering to help because she didn't understand the danger. She was offering because she understood it completely and was choosing to face it with him anyway. This isn't your fight, Zara. These aren't your people to protect. Your sister is an innocent college student who got dragged into this because she shares your last name. Your mother is a woman whose prejudices are learned behavior, not evil intention. If they matter to you, they matter to me. Before he could respond, his phone rang again with updates from his team. Marco had located the SUV used in the kidnapping, abandoned in Queens with surveillance footage showing a transfer to his second vehicle. Tommy had intercepted communications suggesting the Torinos were holding Julia at a warehouse complex they controlled near the Brooklyn waterfront. Most importantly, they had confirmation that the ransom demand would be delivered within the hour, with a meeting time set for midnight. 8 hours to plan and execute a rescue that would require precision, coordination, and more than a little luck. I'm going with you, Zara said before he could voice any of the objections she could see forming. Absolutely not. You're staying here where you're safe. Safe from what? If you die tonight, how long do you think it'll take them to find me? If your sister dies because you couldn't save her, how long before your family decides I'm to blame for distracting you? The logic was unassailable, and they both knew it. She was already too deeply involved to retreat to safety, too connected to his life to remain a neutral observer. But more than that, he could see in her eyes the same fierce protectiveness that drove his own decision-making. The recognition that love meant standing together against threats rather than hiding behind other people's sacrifices. What skills do you have that would help in this situation? Photography teaches you to observe details others miss, to notice patterns and anomalies, to work with different lighting conditions and sight lines. Plus, I'm small enough to fit through spaces your men can't access, and I'm good with electronics. Electronics? I put myself through college working as a freelance tech support specialist. I can disable security systems, work with communication equipment, handle surveillance cameras. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of his war council, Marco and Tommy and 3 other men whose presence filled the penthouse with the focused tension of professionals preparing for battle. They spread building blueprints across his dining room table, discussed approach routes and extraction plans, coordinated timing with backup teams positioned throughout the city. Zara listened without comment, but he could see her absorbing information, following tactical discussions with the kind of comprehension that suggested someone who understood strategy even if she lacked experience with violent implementation. When Marco outlined the security systems protecting the warehouse complex, she stepped forward to point out vulnerabilities in their electronic defenses that his team had missed. When Tommy expressed concern about maintaining communication during the operation, she sketched out a relay system using consumer electronics that would be harder to intercept than their usual equipment. Her suggestions were practical and insightful, earning grudging respect from men who had initially viewed her as a liability rather than an asset. By the time they were ready to move, she had somehow become an integral part of the plan despite Alessio's ongoing resistance to putting her in danger. She would handle electronic surveillance and communication support, staying in the van with Marco while Alessio and the assault team entered the building to locate and extract Julia. The warehouse district at night was exactly as ominous as every crime movie had ever suggested, all shadows and empty spaces that could hide threats or opportunities with equal ease. From their position in the surveillance van, Zara watched Alessio and his team approach the target building with professional precision, moving through darkness like they had done this countless times before. Everything went wrong at exactly 11:43. The Torino family had anticipated a rescue attempt, had positioned snipers and additional security that turned what should have been a swift extraction into a running firefight. Worse, they had moved Julia to a different location within the complex, forcing Alessio's team to search multiple buildings while under heavy fire. It was Zara who spotted the movement in the building adjacent to their primary target, a flash of light that could have been a reflection but felt wrong in the context of everything else she was observing through her camera's telephoto lens. When she focused on the window, she could make out figures that included a young woman with dark hair who matched the photographs of Julia that Alessio carried in his wallet. They moved her, she reported through the communication system. Building C, 3rd floor, northeast corner. The information reached Alessio's team just as they were preparing to assault an empty building, saving them from a trap that would have cost precious time and possibly lives. But it also revealed that the Torinos had planned for multiple contingencies, which meant the escape routes his team was counting on might be compromised as well. That was when the second vehicle arrived, carrying reinforcements that included an older woman who moved with obvious authority despite being escorted by armed guards. Through her camera lens, Zara realized with shock that she was looking at Alessio's mother, apparently taken from her own home and brought here as additional leverage. Marco, they have his mother too. Building C, ground level, being moved inside now. The news hit Alessio's team like a physical blow, transforming a difficult rescue into a nearly impossible one. They were now facing a scenario where the Torinos held both pieces of bait needed to force Alessio into complete surrender, while possessing enough firepower to make any rescue attempt extremely costly. But they had also made a mistake by consolidating their hostages in the same location, creating an opportunity for someone small and quiet and skilled with electronics to approach from an angle they wouldn't expect. Against every order she had been given, against every instinct for self-preservation, Zara slipped out of the van while Marco was coordinating with the assault team and began making her way toward Building C through the maze of abandoned structures that filled the warehouse complex. She reached the building's service entrance just as the gunfire reached its crescendo, using the noise and chaos to mask her approach. The electronic lock on the door was old but functional, and it took her less than 3 minutes to bypass it using techniques that felt surreal to employ in a life-or-death situation. Inside, she could hear voices and movement from the upper floors, but the ground level seemed to be serving as a staging area rather than a guard post. She found Alessio's mother tied to a chair in what had once been an office, conscious but clearly terrified, with duct tape covering her mouth and zip ties securing her wrists. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them as Zara cut through the restraints and helped the older woman to her feet. This was the same person who had called her a whore less than 8 hours earlier, who had demanded that her son choose between family loyalty and romantic love. "Can you walk?" Zara whispered. His mother nodded, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. Together, they made their way toward the exit, moving as quietly as possible through corridors that echoed with the sounds of ongoing combat from the floors above. They had almost reached the door when one of the Torino guards rounded the corner, his weapon already raised and his finger moving toward the trigger. There was no time for strategy or careful planning, only the split-second decision to step between the gun and the woman behind her. The bullet caught Zara in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the concrete wall with enough force to make stars explode across her vision. But the impact also bought enough time for Marco and Tommy to breach the entrance, their return fire eliminating the threat before he could shoot again. The rest of the rescue blurred together in a haze of pain and adrenaline. Julia was extracted safely from the third floor. The remaining Torino operatives were neutralized with extreme prejudice. By the time Alessio reached the ground floor and found Zara bleeding but conscious, the immediate crisis was over and the larger threat had been eliminated permanently. But the sight of her injured while protecting his mother created a transformation in his expression that went beyond relief or gratitude. Kneeling beside her as the paramedics worked to stabilize her shoulder, he looked like a man who had just realized that some choices were too important to compromise about. When his mother approached them, moving slowly and clearly still processing everything that had happened, the conversation that followed was conducted in voices too quiet for anyone else to hear. But Zara saw tears in the older woman's eyes, saw her reach out to touch Zara's uninjured hand with something that looked like respect. 3 hours later, in a private room at the hospital where his family's influence guaranteed discretion and the best possible care, Alessio sat beside her bed and said the words that changed everything between them forever. "Marry me. Not because of what happened tonight, not because you saved my mother's life, but because I can't imagine building a future that doesn't have you at the center of it." "What about your family's expectations?" she asked, though her heart was already racing with hope and possibility. "My family will learn to love you the way I do, or they'll learn to live with the consequences of their prejudices. But I won't spend another day pretending that tradition is more important than the woman who makes me want to be a better man." When she said yes, kissing him despite the pain medication that made her feel fuzzy and disconnected, Zara knew they were choosing love over convenience, passion over prejudice, the difficult path toward building something new rather than the easy road of accepting what already existed. Outside the hospital window, dawn was breaking over a city that looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago, though everything that mattered had been transformed completely. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Zara stood in the same waterfront venue where they had first met, watching Alessio work the room at another charity gala with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The children's hospital had rebuilt after the attack, adding security measures that made the elegant space feel safer without diminishing its warmth. And tonight the event was raising funds for trauma counseling services that would help other families recover from unexpected violence. Her engagement ring caught the light as she adjusted her camera settings, the emerald-cut diamonds surrounded by smaller stones that had belonged to Alessio's grandmother. When he had slipped it onto her finger 3 weeks after she was released from the hospital, he had told her the story of the woman who had worn it before her, an Irish immigrant who had loved an Italian man despite her family's disapproval and had built a marriage that lasted 63 years. "Some things are worth fighting for," he had said, echoing words his grandmother had spoken when the neighborhood had whispered about her mixed marriage in 1952. Tonight, those whispers had been replaced by respectful acknowledgement from the same social circles that had once questioned his choice. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been decisive. When Alessio Marcelli chose to love publicly and without apology, the people in his orbit had learned to adjust their expectations rather than risk losing access to his influence and resources. His mother's journey had been more gradual but equally complete. The woman who had called Zara a whore was now approaching her with a warm smile and a plate of the sfogliatelle she had learned to make using Zara's grandmother's recipe, a gesture of cultural bridge building that had taken months of patient conversation to achieve. "You look beautiful tonight, Cara," the older woman said, the endearment delivered with genuine affection rather than obligation. "Thank you, Mama Francesca. You look lovely yourself." The title had been Alessio's mother's suggestion, offered during a tearful conversation 2 months after the rescue, when she had finally acknowledged that her prejudices had nearly cost her both her children and the woman who had saved her life. The formal adoption of Italian family terminology had felt strange at first, but now it rolled off Zara's tongue naturally, another symbol of the life she was choosing to build. Are you getting good pictures tonight? The hospital board wants to use some for their annual report, and they specifically requested your work. That was another change that still felt surreal. Her photography business had exploded after word spread that she was Alessio Marcelli's fiancée, but instead of feeling like charity, the opportunities felt like recognition of skills that had always existed but had never had the right platform for exposure. She was booked solid through the next year with corporate events, family portraits, and artistic projects that paid enough to make her financially independent despite her engagement to a wealthy man. Independence remained important to her, and Alessio understood that in ways that made her love him even more. Several, she said, showing his mother the camera's display screen with images of children laughing during the early evening activities. I think this one of little Maria with the face paint might be my favorite. She's precious. You know, she reminds me of how I imagine your children will look. The comment was delivered casually, but Zara caught the hope underlying it. Mama Francesca had spent the past month dropping increasingly obvious hints about grandchildren, especially since Julia had announced her engagement to the art history teacher she had been dating when she was kidnapped. The family was expanding in ways that felt natural and joyful rather than obligatory. We're still planning the wedding first, Zara replied diplomatically. But after that, who knows? The wedding preparations had been an education in compromise and cultural blending that would have challenged even the most diplomatic negotiators. Her parents had flown in from Atlanta with opinions about everything from venue selection to guest list management, while his extended family had traditions dating back generations that couldn't be easily modified. Somehow, they had crafted a ceremony that honored both backgrounds without sacrificing the personal vision of what their marriage should represent. 2 more months, and then you'll officially be family, his mother said, patting Zara's arm gently. I can't wait to see Alessio's face when you walk down that aisle. Neither could Zara, if she was honest. They had chosen to write their own vows, a decision that had required weeks of careful consideration about how to express promises that encompassed both personal commitment and cultural transformation. She had struggled with finding words that captured the magnitude of what loving him had meant for her own growth, while he had spent hours crafting language that acknowledged his journey from prejudice to understanding. Speaking of Alessio, his mother continued, glancing toward the center of the room where he was deep in conversation with City Councilman Rodriguez about a community development project. I should tell you that he's been working on something special for tonight. Special how? You'll see. But I think you'll appreciate the gesture. 20 minutes later, when the evening's program began with speeches from hospital administrators and board members, Zara understood what his mother had meant. Alessio had been invited to speak about the impact of trauma recovery services, but instead of delivering the standard wealthy donor remarks, he had chosen to tell a very different story. 6 months ago, he said, speaking to an audience of several hundred people who represented the pinnacle of New York society, I was a man who thought he knew exactly what he wanted from life and exactly what kind of person would fit into his carefully planned future. His eyes found hers across the room as he continued, and she could see both love and vulnerability in his expression as he prepared to share truths that would have been unthinkable before their relationship transformed him. I had inherited not just a business and a lifestyle, but a set of assumptions about race, culture, and compatibility that I had never examined critically because they had never been challenged by reality. The room had grown very quiet, several hundred people recognizing that they were hearing something unprecedented from a man whose privacy was legendary and whose personal life was usually kept completely separate from his public persona. That night, this venue was attacked by people who wanted to eliminate me and anyone who stood with me. A woman I had never met, a photographer who was just doing her job, made a split-second decision to save my life at considerable risk to her own safety. That woman was Zara Williams, and she taught me that courage, intelligence, and love don't recognize the boundaries we create in our minds about who belongs in our lives. Applause began building throughout the room, but he raised his hand to continue before it could reach full volume. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I would be planning to marry a black woman, to build a family that looks different from what 4 generations of tradition had established, I would have dismissed the possibility without consideration. Tonight, I want to publicly acknowledge that my previous certainties were based on prejudice rather than principle. and that the woman who saved my life has continued saving it every day since by showing me what love looks like when it's not limited by fear. When the applause came this time, it was sustained and enthusiastic, a recognition that went beyond polite social response to something that felt like genuine admiration for both his honesty and his transformation. Zara felt tears streaming down her face as she watched him conclude his remarks with a declaration of love that was simultaneously personal and political. Later that evening, as they walked through his penthouse preparing for bed, she found herself reflecting on how completely their lives had changed while still maintaining the essential elements that had drawn them together in the first place. "Your speech tonight," she said, settling onto the sofa where she had slept during those first vulnerable days. "That was beautiful and brave, and probably more honest than most people expected." "Most people need to hear that kind of honesty more often," he replied, joining her and pulling her against his side with the casual intimacy that had become second nature to them both. Change doesn't happen when people hide their growth behind political correctness or social expectations. Do you ever regret it? The complications, the way it's changed your relationships with some people? Never. The only thing I regret is how long it took me to understand what I was missing by limiting myself to what felt safe and familiar. 2 years later, on a Sunday morning in early spring, Zara stood in the nursery they had spent weeks preparing, watching Alessio assemble a crib with the careful attention to detail he brought to everything that mattered to him. Her pregnancy was just beginning to show, a gentle curve that represented the future they had chosen to build together despite every obstacle that had seemed insurmountable when they first met. The room was a perfect blend of both their influences, with Italian family photographs alongside images from her parents' wedding in Atlanta, children's books in multiple languages, and artwork that celebrated the cultural richness their children would inherit. Through the windows, they could see Central Park beginning to bloom with the promise of another season, another year of growth and possibility. His mother was arriving for Sunday dinner in an hour, along with Julia and her new husband, Zara's parents who were visiting from Atlanta, and Marco with his wife and twin daughters who called Zara Zia with the same affection they showed to blood relatives. The dining room would be full of voices speaking in different accents about shared dreams and family plans that transcended any single cultural tradition. "You know," she said, placing her hand on the small swell of her stomach, "when I was growing up, I used to worry about whether I'd ever find someone who could see past surface differences to the person underneath. And now I'm married to a man who had to learn to see past his own assumptions about what love should look like. And somehow that makes our connection feel more intentional rather than less meaningful." He stood and crossed to where she was standing, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same gentle reverence he had shown from the very beginning. In his eyes, she could see the boy who had been taught to fear difference and the man who had chosen to embrace transformation, both versions of him part of the person she had fallen in love with. "Our children are going to grow up in a world where love doesn't have to justify itself to anyone," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had moved beyond hoping for change to actively creating it. When he kissed her, surrounded by the evidence of the life they were building together, Zara thought about all the people who might be watching their story unfold and wondering if their own prejudices were as unshakable as they had always believed. Some of the most beautiful things in life happen when we stop limiting our dreams to what feels safe and start opening our hearts to what feels true. Love doesn't always arrive in the package we expect, but when it's real, it has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire families, entire communities, entire worldviews about what's possible when we choose courage over comfort. Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the one you never saw coming, the one who challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself and leaves you grateful for the disruption that made space for a love bigger than your imagination had ever allowed.